So as James said, I'm Tom Russell. The practice we have is called Emmett Russell Architects. We're based in Montpellier in central Bristol. Before forming the practice together, Vicky Emmett and I did quite a lot of teaching here at UWE. I taught in all over the school in different roles, but one of the key things we did was to run a second year design studio module in which we did quite a lot of housing work. In teaching housing, I think we became used to scrutinising student housing, scrutinising case studies, trying to understand really what works and what doesn't work in housing. I'm going to talk to you today about the work that we've done in retirement housing, which is a very particular, specific part of the housing sector, and I'm going to talk about how we came to be involved in that sector. As teachers, as I say, we've sort of developed a certain expertise in trying to pull apart and understand the issues around housing. At the time, in the practice, we were very keen to take some of this knowledge and apply it and get involved in some housing projects. But as a new practice, it's very difficult to break into larger projects when you've not previously got experience of doing those kind of projects. So we're scratching around trying to work out how on earth we do get involved in the bigger projects. And the only route open to us really was through competition. There's two types of competition. There's open competition and there's sort of limited or invited competitions. And without the portfolio and experience to be invited to participate in competitions, you only really get the opportunity to do open competitions. Typically you might get 80, 90, 100, 120 different practices putting in entries for an open competition. So they're quite a tall order really. Anyway, we decided our way into housing was through competition. I'll just run through very briefly a couple of competitions that we did to try and get involved in the sector. This is an image which is a plan of Milton Keynes that we produced for a competition. The site for the competition is on the western side where they were expanding, producing a lot of new housing for Milton Keynes. They're interested in providing an exemplar site. Milton Keynes is an interesting city. It's made up of a whole grid structure of new roads, which are lined with trees and with banks and with landscaping that form a network of green space right across the city. Our idea was to continue and take this network of green spaces and to try and insert it within the block. We were aware that with competitions, one of the things that you need to, in order to be in with this chance of winning a competition, you have to have a very clear idea that you can convey very clearly to the judges about what it is that you're doing and achieving in that competition. And in this competition, our idea was to increase the density of this part of town by sort of inverting the relationship of the green space and the built form. Historically, Milton Keynes had come to be known as the city in the forest because as I said before, you could go along these grid roads without even knowing you're in the city because there's so much greenery around all of the green space around the roads. We took this idea that the existing city in the forest could be inverted to become the forest in the city. The green spaces, instead of being lining the roads, could be what links the heart of all of the housing blocks. That was the sort of outcome of our proposal, a series of residential perimeter blocks with a sort of green space that connects between all of them. We won the competition, but sadly, because that was back in 2007, it hit the buffers because of the credit crunch. There wasn't any funding available. Nothing really came of that one. Not to be deterred, we went in for other competitions. This one was an RIBA national competition for new housing in a village in Pembrokeshire called Loreni. Again, we came up with quite a clear idea. We picked up on the left-hand side of the image there, you can see an old walled garden that exists in the site. We saw an interesting precedent in this walled garden as a way of building new housing within the sensitive setting of the national park. Came up with an idea called the walled gardens of Loreni, where new housing was built into these limestone walls of the local landscape. Again, we won the competition, but again, it didn't get built, largely because of the economic factors at the time. So not to be deterred, we came across a few years later another competition called Reimagining Aging. And this was our sort of way in, our foot in the door of the retirement home sector. The competition was organised by the RIBA on behalf of a developer called McCarthy and Stone. Now, McCarthy and Stone are the biggest provider of retirement housing in the UK. They claim to have 70% of all private retirement housing provision. They're a massive house builder. And at the time, they were looking for new ideas for the younger, what's called the baby boomer generation, who were not too enthralled with what they were offering them at the time. The competition was in part a response to a report that was published at the time called the Happy Report, Housing Our Aging Population. It was quite an interesting report that was observing really that the quality of what was offered in the retirement sector was pretty dismal really. And it looked at case studies right across Europe, different examples of retirement housing ideas. If you're ever involved in a retirement housing project, it's really worth having a look at the report because it is full of quite interesting European case studies from Denmark and Holland and Switzerland and Sweden as well, I think. So the report fundamentally identified a series of issues, looked at ways to address those and came up with a series of recommendations. Now, there's a sort of number of challenges and issues that are raised in the report. The UK, like the rest of the world, has a very rapidly growing ageing population. The number of over 60s is projected to increase by 7 million in the next 25 years. So there's a huge pressure, and if you put that in the context of the amount of housing that is being built, it's an enormous number. And provides a major challenge. The housing stock that the ageing population is living in at the moment is largely inaccessible. I think most people live in houses. Houses have got stairs. I think as people become more frail and elderly, that provides pretty substantial challenges. It's part of a wider issue of a housing crisis that is experienced by everybody living across the UK. If you think about the number of people, we're talking about over 60s here, that live in large family houses. In a sense, by failing to provide suitable accommodation for people to downsize into, we are effectively blocking up a huge chunk of the family housing market that's available. So by unlocking the challenges of retirement housing, you're potentially able to unlock much wider problems within the housing supply in this country. And there's huge costs associated with this ageing population. Cost of social care, cost of the NHS, and a lot of it is tied to people living in inappropriate housing. There's something like £1 billion a year spent on dealing with people who've had falls in the home, which is in fairly large part, to do with people living in inappropriate housing situations. So before we talk about the project that we've done, I thought it's worth just highlighting what we're talking about when we're talking about retirement housing. You can see this is an illustration from that Happy Report. You can see various hexagons up there representing the different housing typologies. On the left, you've got the sort of general needs housing, normal housing that you and I understand by housing. As you go further to the right, it becomes more specialist, and so the grey stuff is normal housing that's just been designed or adapted to allow people who are elderly or disabled to live in it. The blue stuff is the stuff we talk about when we talk about retirement housing. It's housing where people live independently, they've got their own flats, but they have varying levels of support to help them live there. Sometimes no support at all, sometimes there might be dining facilities or shared lounges, that kind of thing. And then at the right of those of that sort of spectrum is the sort of non-independent housing, the nursing homes, the care homes, specialist dementia care, and right down in the far bottom corner is hospitals and hospices. So the report came up with a number of recommendations about how to improve the housing that's available. I'm not going to go into any of that in more detail, other than to highlight number 3, because I think it's quite important to sort of understand what some of this particular issue, because I think it has a huge impact on how we think about retirement accommodation. So recommendation number 3 was that building layouts should maximise natural light and ventilation by avoiding internal corridors and single aspect flats. This is what we talk about when we talk about retirement housing. This is what McCarthy and Stone produce. They churn out about 60 of these developments a year, all over the country, typically in suburbs or in small towns, quite often on main roads. Interesting talking to the people in McCarthy and Stone, they said they're often in competition when they're buying land with Aldi and Lidl. So when you see an Aldi and Lidl, think maybe they sort of battled it out for the retirement home provider for the site that they're working on. So as a typical retirement home development, it's a 3-storey development, normally 2-3 stories. These are low-rise developments, but they need lift access to all the flats, so they're generally served by an internal corridor. And I think this is the crux of the issue that interested us as to how you address some of the institutional qualities of the proposal. So back to the competition and our ideas. Before I talk about our proposals, I was just going to talk a little bit about some of the thinking that went on behind the proposals. The competition was for a site in Bishops Waltham, which is in Hampshire. You can see the site there in white. It's a backland site surrounded by back gardens and fields, and formerly occupied by a scrapyard. On the left-hand side to the west of the site, you can see the remains of the Bishop's Palace, which gave Bishops Waltham its name. So we were shortlisted for this project, and when we went for interview, I'm going to sort of show you some of the slides we used in interview to try and sort of talk about the issues around retirement housing and how we'd address them. We started off with this slide, which is an image from a film called The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel. I don't know, some of you might have seen the film. We thought it was quite an interesting encapsulation of some of the issues around providing retirement home for the baby boomer generation. It's a group of people who represent a sort of cross-section of some of these baby boomers that we're talking about. There's people who are married, there's people who are divorced, there's people who are widowed, there's people who are single, people with mobility and disability issues. There are people who have retired, and some of them who are kind of quite interested in developing a second career in their retirement. All of them are united, I guess, in their choice of retirement accommodation. They're obviously going to this Best Exotic Marigold Hotel as their choice. So in a way, all of them are united by a sense that what's available for them in the UK isn't necessarily meeting their needs for one reason or another. So we thought it was kind of an interesting way of looking at the baby boomers as a group. And in undertaking this competition, I think we were quite intrigued to talk to people that we knew. We went out and spent a lot of time. I think everybody's got relatives or colleagues or friends or neighbours, people that they know who are perhaps in this age group, perhaps this sort of 60 to 70 age group, people who are at the point of retirement, but who don't necessarily see themselves as needing retirement accommodation. And I think the more we spoke to people, the more we realised that what an anathema people saw retirement housing as being. It's sort of interesting, the more we spoke to people, the two conclusions that we drew really out of those conversations, one of which was that it's an incredibly diverse group, as diverse as any other random collection of people you can gain. So it's almost impossible to draw common threads amongst them. But the one overriding theme that we got from everybody was that they really don't belong in a retirement home, a retirement accommodation of any kind. So there's a stigma there, and I think that's the sort of crux of the problem really in addressing this issue, is how you develop housing that moves away from the stigma. There's a quote here, and I think in it sort of captures some of the conundrum that we've got in addressing this issue. I think as soon as you start developing housing that's presented as retirement housing, you're immediately alienating the very people that you're trying to provide it for. Anybody who feels that it's aimed at retirement, they immediately think, oh God, that's the last thing I want to do. So there's a kind of interesting to try and speculate about the reasons for that. I think one of the reasons is that a lot of this generation of people have had their own experiences of dealing with their own parents in later life situations, often having to negotiate care homes, retirement complexes of one sort or another. So there's a sort of immediate negative stigma attached to it that from their own experiences of visiting the sorts of places that are around at the moment. I think people in that age group get the kind of heebie-jeebies about anything that describes itself as a retirement proposition. People are also very keen to remain part of their community. People don't really want to be sort of moved into another place. I think they see themselves as being rooted in a community with their community and with their family and want to remain that way. Another factor in the UK is the deep-seated preference people have for houses over flats. The graph that's up here is shows for all the countries of Europe the proportion of people who live in houses which are in blue and flats which are in green. And you can see that the UK is pretty near the bottom of the list over towards the right-hand side there. It's only Ireland and Norway have fewer people living in flats. So there's a sense that people have spent their whole lives in houses. The last thing they want to be doing is making a kind of massive shift to a sort of institutional model of flats. So the challenge here is to overcome some of these preconceptions, to overcome some of these stigmas, and to develop a proposal that has some of the qualities of a neighbourhood and much less of the qualities of an institution of any kind. Now, when we presented our scheme, I think one of the first things we did was to put up a plan of what McCarthy and Stone offer already. So this is a plan that we put in front of the judges, and the judges were largely made up of directors of McCarthy and Stone. And we told them in no uncertain terms all the things we thought were absolutely rubbish about what they produced at the moment. And obviously this is a kind of big company that produced a lot of housing and are quite successful, so they were slightly put out that we were tearing them apart. But I think there's sort of good, clear reasons why what's available at the moment is problematic. This is a typical development of theirs. There's a single entrance to it. Sorry, this is the first floor plan, so you can't see the entrance, but there's a single point of entrance. And with a single point of entrance of a building this size, it means all of the rest of the frontage of that building is dead. There's no people coming in and out, there's no front doors, there's no life, there's very little happening on it. So it creates a real deadness in the space that surrounds it. You can see the building's full of long corridors, pretty gloomy, pretty dark, often smelling of boiled cabbage. There's immediately an institutional feel to those corridors that we've got here. And the flip side of having corridors in a building is that all of the flats become single aspects. And I think this is a really important point. As soon as you introduce a corridor, you're cutting a building in half, so that any flat you've got there has got windows that only point in one direction. You can't get any cross ventilation in that flat. You can't get light or views at different times of day. It has an incredibly negative impact on how you lay out and plan a building. And I think, typically they would have a residence lounge off this corridor that smells of boiled cabbage. And the garden space, I've said it's got dead frontage. Typically you'd have a sort of rose garden that's, again, not very active and a sort of residual space that's left behind that people have to make an active choice to sort of find their way out into the garden to do anything there. So there's a number of things that I think make it feel like an institutional place, not somewhere that a younger generation of person would want to live. Our analysis, when we really pulled it apart, I think it all comes down to the economics of the lift. It's a sort of strange thing to say, but I think the lift has a huge disproportionate impact on how we plan out our buildings. A lift is an expensive piece of kit, costs quite a lot of money, and in order to make make it work economically, it needs to be shared by as many apartments as possible. So in a tower, you're sort of sharing those apartments vertically, but in a low-rise building, as all of these retirement buildings are, it effectively means sharing it along a corridor. So typically, 10 to 15 flats needed to justify the cost of a lift. One way of overcoming this sort of stale internal corridor that I was talking about is to have another approach which would be deck access. So where instead of an internal corridor, you have an external corridor effectively. But I don't think it's necessarily the solution. Deck access is problematic in some ways. Historically, it's been associated with some quite problematic housing. But one of the key things for me is that it doesn't really allow you to open up windows and sort of light on that side of the building. So whilst it's sort of partially double aspect flats, they're not really double aspect flats that you're creating there. So at the crux of our proposition was, I guess, a sort of third way, a way of sharing, providing access at first floor level, sharing lifts, but which was neither an internal corridor nor a deck access, and we've called it the garden walkway. And it takes the idea that's pretty well established in this country of housing, where you separate the public circulation, the road, the pavement, in this case the walkway, from the dwelling itself, and provide a space in between. It takes a lot of forms at the moment in any ordinary building, but here's an example where you have a pavement separated by a sort of basement area from the windows of the ground floor of the building, and that gives privacy to those rooms on the ground floor, and allows public circulation without the sense of intruding into those buildings. The garden is another way of achieving exactly the same thing. So front gardens do the same job. They separate the members of the public in the public realm from the ground floor windows of the housing there. We found an interesting example here, which in a way is quite similar to our garden walkway proposition. This is in Clifton in Bellevue, where there's a sort of communal shared promenade that runs along the building. That's the full story up from the communal garden below. And you can see that the houses have their own little patios that separate the private realm of the interior from the public promenade outside. And you can look down into little courtyards that are happening there. So taking this idea of a garden walkway, we applied it to the site, providing a sort of linear circulation route at first floor level all the way around the site, allowing us to create a series of apartments that, rather than being opened off an internal corridor, were actually had their own front doors to the outside. Everybody has a front courtyard or a front sort of patio, and people feel like they're living much more in a house than perhaps in a flat. So in a way, the circulation becomes more like a street and less like an internal corridor. Similarly, the outside space, by putting all of the communal space on the public side of the building and making that the route through which everybody gets to their flats, you have a very animated outside space overlooked by 50 front doors of 50 different units that creates a sort of heart to the community here. So rather than being a sort of desolate rose garden that you need to find your way out into, it becomes the kind of very active focus of all of the community life of the development. So that we're sort of trying to break down the institutional aspects of the retirement housing. So the idea of the kind of institutional corridor and the institutional garden. Equally, the residence lounge is something that we thought needed a bit of addressing, the one that's entered off the old corridor. We felt by providing communal facilities for the development, but putting them outside as a sort of clubhouse, they become something that people are much more actively able to go and use in different ways. So the development provides a series of different opportunities for a kind of collective and communal life without it feeling like you're kind of stuck in a residence lounge. So the ideas I've talked about so far are all really about the sort of abstract ideas about how you get around and construct a retirement accommodation. Obviously, we're working in a real context here. So the proposal we had is in some ways a direct response to its place and its context. The Bishop's Palace that I mentioned briefly earlier, just to the west of the site, provided the starting point for our thinking about it. This is a Bishop's Palace from the time of Henry VIII. It offered quite an interesting model of a building which was focused around a central green space and formed a sort of perimeter around the edge of that green space. The town of Bishops Waltham is a fairly small town that's low in terms of building height is relatively low. Most of the buildings are 2 stories, so it's important to respect that kind of scale. And I think we picked up on some of the materials that are used in the area. There's a lot of brick in the area. We're also interested in how tiles can be used to mark a threshold and an entry into a building. This is the tiles that are in the nearby Winchester Cathedral, marking a kind of entrance point and a threshold. So this is a sort of image of our proposals as we came up with them. You can see the tiles down in the courtyard there, marking the entrance and the way into the development. But I guess the key thing to try and get across from this image is this idea of a garden walkway as an alternative to both the sort of deck access system or an internal corridor, a way of providing a sort of promenade that links right round the development at first floor level and provides a sort of circulation route and a series of entrances into people's own apartments. And whilst they're apartments, they're all got their own external front doors. The ground floor apartments have all got their own private sunken courtyards, and the first floor ones have these sort of patios opening onto the garden walkway. So the site strategy, it's a fairly simple one, was creating a square. Parking is always a huge driver in any housing project. The number of cars you're trying to incorporate, and trying to design the parking in such a way that you don't end up with a sort of huge swathe of parking, but equally that people are able to come quite close to their front doors, particularly in this type of development for the elderly. So we've tried to integrate the parking into the sort of landscape streets immediately in front of the dwellings. So there's an image of the overall landscape strategy with a formal garden in the middle surrounded by these streets which accommodate most of the parking for the development, while the spaces behind the buildings. So each apartment has its own garden at ground floor level. All the first floor apartments have a sort of patio at the front and a balcony at the back. So the green spaces are incredibly important in terms of providing both for the private and the communal life of the community here. That gives you, in a sense, an impression of what we were envisaging in terms of the central green space, a large space that's sort of broken down into smaller elements to provide different layers and levels of activities for people using the space. At first floor level, as I've said, the walkway links all of the different flats, so that we've got 50 flats here that can be served off two lifts. But as well as the lift, there's a staircase for every pair of flats, allowing a sort of quick connection for those who are able to use stairs to get up and down. But it also helps to animate the external space, so you get very active frontages all the way around this square that we're creating. So onto the apartments themselves. It's, as I said, a low-rise development. It's 3 stories, but essentially it's a ground floor flat focused around a courtyard, and then a first floor masonette, which has the main rooms, living, dining, kitchen, and a bedroom and a bathroom on that entrance level at first floor. But there's a sort of bonus extra room up in the roof space. It's all about really trying to convey the sense of having the thing reading more like a house and much less like an apartment, a sort of flat, I guess. So just quickly to sort of highlight the plans here. This is a plan of the ground floor unit with the entrance at the front and the communal space at the front here. There's 2 bedrooms available, so there's a sort of second bedroom which could act as a study to give people glimpses and connection with what's happening out in the public realm out here. There's a kitchen and dining room facing the front courtyard with views out to the front and a more private living space at the back, and a fairly generous bathroom and a generous bedroom opening onto the garden out the back here with a utility room for each unit. So they're quite sort of generous units. Everybody's got a spare bedroom, everybody's got a utility room, everybody's got a sense of kind of views and connection into the space that's out the front there. And the upper level, there's a sort of private patio that you enter through. Again, there's a kitchen dining room facing out onto the public realm at the front here, and a more private sitting room at the back there with a bedroom and a bathroom, and a stair going up to a sort of second bedroom up in the loft space there. That's the sort of view of it from behind, and a sort of cutaway perspective of what one of those first floor flats might be like. It's sort of interesting that in retirement housing, you never seem to get roof lights anyway. You always have top floor flats with amazing opportunities to bring light into them, but for some reason, it's just not something that is done in that sort of mainstream housing. I think adaptability and the ability for people to kind of change and take ownership of their building is quite important. There's lots of debates had in this area about whether people want open plan arrangements with living, dining, kitchens all in one space, or whether people want to separate it. So it's quite important to design it in such a way that it worked both ways. So it's very easy. You can see where that sort of yellow space is in the middle to put in a partition wall that allows it to work as separate living room from the kitchen dining space, or to all work together. Storage, another fantastically important area. All of these people are moving from pretty big houses and downsizing effectively. So the ability to accommodate all of their stuff, quite an important factor. We won the competition, but this was the headlines and the building design that week. I think we were aware really that the competition wasn't going to be built. It's an interesting one. There's this character, Howard Phillips, he was the chief executive of McCarthy and Stone at the time when the competition was first promoted. He was quite interested in how you go about transforming and changing what's available, the housing market for retired people. But I think he quite quickly realised that McCarthy and Stone probably weren't going to be the company that was able to deliver on these changes. He left and formed a new company who are called Pegasus Life, and they've sort of pursued a very different channel, a much more kind of innovative way really of dealing with retirement housing. And McCarthy and Stone were sort of left with us as architects, trying to find a sort of something to do with us. The new chief exec who came from a background which is much more involved in mainstream house building, and I think the agenda shifted from finding new ways and new typologies for retirement housing to finding how they could deliver their existing standard housing types in a more sort of quick and efficient way. So we sort of found ourselves in a funny situation of being slightly out of step with the company that we'd just started to work with. Anyway, they found us a site. They said, you don't get to build the competition, but we like your help looking at a tricky site that we're trying to deal with in Wendover in Buckinghamshire. This is the site of a former vicarage, this site here, just on the edge of Wendover. Rather beautiful part of the world. It's in the Chilterns. It's very near the Prime Minister's official country residence, Chequers. It's sort of in that part of the world. The building that was on this site was a Grade 2 listed building. It's an arts and crafts house by an early arts and crafts architect called George Devey. You can see it's a picture from the 19th century, shows it in its former glory. The sort of red is highlighting all the chimneys that have been lost over the years. This was the building as we found it. You can see it's rather overgrown. It's been added to. There's a 1960s sort of care home extension that's been bodged onto the side of it, and the landscape is all rather overgrown. This is the building on the street side of it. So in a way, the task we had was to try and, again, come up with a form of retirement housing for a younger generation of retirees that would appeal to those not really interested in the more institutional offer that McCarthy and Stone put together. But architecturally, I guess the challenge was how to sort of liberate this old listed building from the agglomeration of stuff that had started to sort of swallow it. So the kind of key move really was to separate the building out, to restore and convert the old house to provide 5 flats, but to also restore some of its former glory while finding space on the site to try and develop a new proposal. We went through a whole series of different kind of ideas, trying to work out how to deliver this. And I think we realised that in order to try and come up with a proposal that worked, that had a sort of good relationship with the existing building, whilst we were separating the new building from the old one, we were able to find a sort of external space that linked the two. So we developed this sort of U-shaped plan with a communal courtyard in between them that seemed to sort of balance the sort of tension between the old and the new part of it. We modelled the proposal in various different ways. We became quite interested in the language of arts and crafts architecture. It's an image from a kind of quite a good book on the subject. And it sort of picks up on some of the themes we were looking at, really. The use of gables is a kind of strong one in the arts and crafts movement. You can see the brick mullion in the middle of the window there was something we were sort of playing around with. These big, tall, ornate chimneys and the plain tiles with sort of sharp-edged roof verges, all things which were sort of part of the mix. There's a sort of challenge really when you're working with a listed building in trying to find a way that you can build something new whilst at the same time doing something that's sort of positive to the setting of the listed building. So in planning terms, McCarthy and Stone saw this as a challenge because they're used to being kind of refused anything in a vaguely sensitive location. So the challenge that we had was to try and do something that kind of rose to that challenge, really. It was kind of interesting. It was interesting working with them on a real project because we realised that actually they had no experience of building anything that didn't have an internal corridor. So whilst the building that we proposed is fairly simple, it's got 2 circulation cores, lift and stairs here, and a series of flats, all of which were dual aspect flats. It was a complete revelation to the people at McCarthy and Stone that you could build a retirement home development of apartments that without a corridor. It was which I found kind of extraordinary. But this is the plan that we put forward. I guess the things that we held on to from that happy report were this idea of maintaining double aspect flats. So you've got windows on the north side, windows on the south side that allow cross ventilation and allow sort of changing light as you go throughout the day. The lack of the corridor was quite important. The idea that everybody on the ground floor has their own private gardens was another thing that was quite important to us. So we developed the proposal. We managed to win planning consent for the proposal. This was one of our planning drawings. We were, as I said before, we were kind of interested in the language, how you do a building that is contemporary but also picks up on the language of arts and crafts architecture. So the tiled verges, the brick mullions that we've got, the sort of gables, the asymmetry of the gables that the arts and crafts use were all things that we sort of picked up on in the design of the building. And we got to build it. Up until this point as a practice, biggest thing we'd ever built was about the Scout Hut, which cost £350,000, I think. Suddenly we were working on a £7 million building, incredibly exciting and a massive learning curve for us. And for us, it was the point at which suddenly, in all of the whenever you get an opportunity for a new building, you always have to fill out a questionnaire about your previous experience. It's the first time we were suddenly able to sort of tick the box that said, have you done one of these before? Have you built anything more than a sort of small extension before? So it had a big impact on us as a practice and a big learning curve. But it had frustrations as well. We were working with a company that had a very set way of doing things. They had a construction company that were geared up to delivering a standard product with standard details. So navigating that was quite interesting. So the building managed to restore the old building and build a building next to it that sort of complemented it. We put back some of the old chimneys on the on the original house, as you can see there. And we developed an architecture which was, a contemporary architecture, but that picked up on some of the cues from the arts and crafts movement. But crucially, I think the overarching achievement was to build a building essentially without internal corridors. I mean, that as a retirement home proposition, I think was the most radical thing that's in some ways utterly banal. But the idea that every flat is the dual aspect flat and there's no internal corridors, I think was weirdly innovative in this particular context. And the flats have been done very well. They've been successful in attracting a younger group of retirees. That wasn't the end of our involvement with McCarthy and Stone. They saw us having won planning permission on a very sensitive site as being architects who could get them planning for things that they were struggling with. So they gave us another site. This one, incredibly visible, prominent, sensitive site in Southsea on the seafront, which is in Portsmouth, right next to the main pier there. You can see the site there. Historically, it had been right at the heart of the seaside economy of the place, but it had become run down. It used to belong to Harry Redknapp, who's a big Portsmouth football manager, and mysteriously part of it burnt down under his ownership, which was slightly curious. So as we came to the site, it was this. It was a gap site in a really prominent part on the seafront in Southsea. And I guess we saw it really as a sort of missing tooth in the Southsea seafront. So the project really was about stitching together a piece of urban realm which had been sort of ripped apart and torn open, and providing something that sort of re-established that bit of seafront. So the building we developed, it's a huge building, 96 flats, 7 stories, supermarket on the ground floor. And I guess what we saw as being important is providing something that had some of that sort of character and life to it on the seafront. It's very exposed seafront, south-facing, so it's very important that for the retired people to be able to kind of live out and enjoy these spectacular views they had, they needed a bit of protection. So we developed a sort of architecture which was about looking at the proportions of seafront buildings, understanding how you create a sort of piece of urban frontage and how you provide a balcony that sort of gives shading and protection to the flat behind, but creates a bit of life on that sea frontage. So you can see there the sort of typical section of the piece of building that we put forward. You can imagine that up until now we've only really been doing house extensions. So being given this £17 million 7-storey building was quite a challenge for us. But interestingly, I think what we found working with them was that actually we felt like the only ones who knew what we were doing, which was kind of slightly terrifying. I think you find with a big organisation there's a sort of compartmentalisation and a separation between those who buy the land, those who get planning, those who do the technical stuff of design, those who then get on and build the thing. And we were the only people providing any continuity between those stages of the project. Anyway, we produced a building which hopefully provided a bit of, that completed that bit of frontage. I think we had a frustration in terms of the plan. We offered them very early on in the process a proposal which again did away with corridors and provided sea views for all of the flats. That was a sort of early sketch we did. They very quickly rejected that. They wanted the corridors. They were very clear that the project, the lifts were absolutely, lifts in these developments are large lifts. They have to allow for residents to be removed horizontally from the building as well as vertically, whether it's in a coffin or in an ambulance stretcher. So the costs of these are pretty substantial. They were very clear that the corridor was the sort of only way forward for them. Just trying to debate. So I'm sort of just about run out of time, haven't I? 10 minutes. Okay. I just throw this slide in here very quickly. Just to point out, this is another project we've done. This is for council housing. It's not specialist retirement housing, but interestingly, it's one-bedroom flats that have been designed for downsizers. So in a way, it's a project that's become occupied by exactly the kind of group of people that all of these other projects were trying to attract, and by getting away from the idea of it being a retirement development, you're sort of taking off all the pressure. So I think perhaps part of the sort of challenge facing this sector isn't how you design retirement housing better, it's how you design ordinary housing that's suitable for people who are retired, perhaps. I was just going to do a little kind of epilogue, which is another project that we did for Pegasus Life, who are the company that was set up by the old chief executive of McCarthy and Stone. So he set up a new company looking at new models, interesting ideas around housing, and they asked us to do a competition. In this case, it was an invited competition, only with 2 or 3 architects, I think. So we were mostly up against Sarah Wigglesworth for this one, which is a project on the south coast of Devon, Shell Cove. So I'll just run through just a few quick slides of what's happening here. It was an amazing site, fantastic views of, again, sea views that needed to be taken advantage of. There's a site plan there showing the trees on the site. The trees are an incredibly important part of this piece of coastline. It's a cliff-top site surrounded by trees, amazing Scots pines and things. So the trees were a sort of no-go zone in terms of the development. The existing house on the site was an old Georgian house, so we thought the house ought to be retained, and the views from the house, the zone in front of the house, again, ought to be excluded from any potential development plots. So by a process of elimination, it gave us the brown areas marked up there as areas that were sort of available for development. We were looking at, again, designing a variety of retirement home apartments. We thought that the most important thing was that everyone had this incredible sea view. So we designed apartments that were very narrow and very deep in plan, and all of which framed a different version of the extraordinary sea view that's available here. They were designed around a spine walkway, which linked all the various different aspects of the proposals. There's low-rise development that avoided blocking views from any of the existing buildings around the site and allowed everybody to retain these fantastic sea views. All of the sort of vehicular circulation, access, parking, all kept on the sort of entrance side of the site, close to the road, to leave the rest of the site free as a sort of pedestrian access zone. And the shared elements were, again, quite important as part of the scheme, a variety of different sorts of gardens for a whole series of different activities. We put a swimming pool as part of the mix, and some space for a sort of communal club room in the old Georgian house. That was the proposal that we put forward. You can see the linear house types there have been developed in order to ensure that every flat had fantastic full width living room, dining, kitchen that opened out onto this amazing view. And in order to do that, we had this deep plan, which was a sort of courtyard plan, which meant that the bedroom opened onto a courtyard. There was the opportunity to have sort of secondary views from the bedroom through the living room out into the view. But again, we developed it in a way that provided a sort of walkway on the left-hand side there that provided access to all of the flats. That's a kind of three-dimensional image of what was created there. So as a sort of roundabout way, we sort of started with a competition and ended with a competition and had a whole kind of learning curve of experience, understanding retirement housing in the middle. I think that's full circle, I think is where we got to. Thank you.